The weather station at Naval Air Station Oceana registered winds at 87 knots when the call came through. Rain hammered the tarmac like artillery shells, turning the Virginia coastline into a blur of gray violence. Inside the operations center, seasoned officers stared at satellite imagery that resembled abstract art more than meteorological data. The storm system stretched from Cape Hatteras to Nova Scotia, a wall of atmospheric fury that had already claimed 2 cargo vessels and grounded every aircraft on the eastern seaboard. Negative control. Weather's a no-go for any airborne operations. The voice belonged to Commander Jake Morrison, a 20-year veteran with more carrier landings than most pilots had total flight hours. His weathered face reflected the green glow of radar screens showing nothing but chaos. "We've got zero visibility, Category 4 winds, and electrical activity that would fry every system on a Super Hornet." The emergency originated 12 hours earlier. A Navy SEAL team, call sign Neptune 7, had been conducting classified reconnaissance on a Russian submarine that had strayed into restricted waters off the Outer Banks. But the storm had accelerated beyond all predictions, catching the 8-man team on a rapidly deteriorating platform. Their extraction helicopter had turned back after encountering winds that nearly tore its rotors apart. "Neptune 7, this is Oceana Control. Confirm your status, over." The radio operator's voice carried professional calm, masking genuine concern. These weren't ordinary sailors caught in bad weather. These were America's most elite warriors, trained to survive anything nature could unleash. But even SEALs couldn't fight physics. "Control, Neptune 7 actual." The response crackled through static, barely audible above the atmospheric interference. "Platform compromised. Estimate 4 hours before total structural failure. Medical emergency, Rodriguez has hypothermia, condition deteriorating. Request immediate dust-off." Commander Morrison rubbed his temples, staring at the tactical display. Every aircraft in the Atlantic Fleet had been grounded. The Coast Guard's most experienced rescue pilots had declared the weather unsurvivable. Even the Air Force's specialized combat search and rescue squadrons had pulled back to wait for the storm's passage. That's when she walked into the briefing room. Lieutenant Commander Nix Castellanos moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. At 34, she carried herself like a veteran despite looking younger than most ensigns. Her flight suit bore no decorative patches, no boastful squadron insignia, just her name tape, wings, and a small pin that most people never noticed. Those who did recognize it usually stepped back with newfound respect. Morrison glanced up, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to barely concealed irritation. "Castellanos, unless you're here to tell me the weather magically improved, I don't have time for." "Sir, I've been monitoring Neptune 7's situation." Her voice cut through the operational chatter like a blade through silk. "I'd like to volunteer for the extraction mission." The briefing room fell silent, except for the rain drumming against reinforced windows. Lieutenant Commander Nix Castellanos had earned her call sign, Phantom, not through bravado or lucky breaks, but through a combination of surgical precision and an almost supernatural ability to appear where enemies least expected her. During her first deployment over Afghanistan, she had flown 73 combat missions without losing a single aircraft or failing to reach her target. Her FA-18F Super Hornet had become legendary among ground troops who knew that when the weather turned hellish and other pilots couldn't fly, Phantom would still answer the call. But legends, Morrison knew, didn't alter the laws of aerodynamics or atmospheric science. "Castellanos, I appreciate the gesture, but look at these readings." He gestured toward the meteorological display, where violent reds and purples painted a picture of atmospheric chaos. "We're talking about sustained winds exceeding 90 knots, with gusts reaching 120. The cloud ceiling is practically on the deck, visibility is 0-0, and the electrical activity would scramble every instrument you've got." Nick stepped closer to the display, studying the storm structure with the analytical eye of someone who had spent years learning to read weather as a tactical variable. "Sir, I see a narrow corridor here, approximately 15 miles southeast of the SEAL team's position. The eye wall has a slight distortion. There's a gap in the worst activity. A gap that lasts maybe 8 minutes before it closes," Morrison countered. "Even if you could thread that needle, you'd still have to land on a platform that's being torn apart by 12-foot swells in near-hurricane conditions." The other officers in the room exchanged glances. They knew Phantom's reputation, but they also understood that courage couldn't overcome impossible physics. The storm system showed no signs of weakening, and Neptune 7's situation was deteriorating by the hour. "Ma'am, with all due respect," spoke up Lieutenant Doug Chen, the squadron's meteorology officer, "I've been tracking severe weather for 8 years. I've never seen atmospheric conditions this violent. The wind shear alone would rip apart any aircraft that tried to penetrate this system." Nix nodded, acknowledging his expertise while her eyes remained fixed on the weather data. She had flown through sandstorms in Iraq that blinded satellites, navigated through Taliban-controlled valleys where the mountains created their own violent weather patterns, and landed damaged aircraft in conditions that would have challenged test pilots. But this storm represented something different, not just dangerous flying, but potentially suicidal. "Neptune 7, control." The radio crackled again, urgent now. "Need updated status on medical emergency, over." The response came fragmented through increasing interference. "Rodriguez, core temp dropping, condition critical, estimate, hours before." The transmission dissolved into static. Morrison slammed his palm against the communications console. "Damn it, we're losing comms with them." He turned to face the assembled officers. "I'm not sending anyone into that storm. We wait for conditions to improve." "Sir," Nick said quietly, "by the time conditions improve, there won't be anyone left to rescue." Commander Morrison had seen enough young pilots die trying to be heroes. He'd written letters to families, attended funerals, and learned that sometimes the hardest decision was knowing when not to fight. The storm raging outside wasn't an enemy that could be outmaneuvered or outsmarted. It was raw natural force that cared nothing for human courage or technological superiority. "Phantom, I know your record. I know what you've accomplished. But this isn't about skill or determination." His voice carried the weight of command responsibility. "This is about physics. No pilot, no matter how good, can fly through conditions like this." Nix remained silent for a long moment, studying the tactical display where Neptune 7's beacon pulsed weakly through electronic interference. She thought about the 8 men trapped on that disintegrating platform, about Rodriguez slowly dying from hypothermia while his teammates could only watch. In her mind, she could see their faces, not the confident, invincible SEALs of recruitment posters, but frightened human beings facing death in one of its cruelest forms. "Sir, permission to speak freely." Morrison nodded. 3 years ago, over Kandahar, I flew through a sandstorm that meteorology said was impossible to navigate. Visibility was zero, I had no instruments, and Taliban fighters were shooting SAMs through the dust. She paused, her voice steady and professional. "I brought home 6 Marines who would have died otherwise. They told me afterward that they'd given up hope when they heard the weather report." "This is different, Phantom. That was Afghanistan, not the North Atlantic in November." "Yes, sir. It's different because those Marines weren't Navy SEALs, and they weren't dying of hypothermia while we debated meteorological data." The briefing room remained silent except for the storm's fury against the windows. Morrison felt the weight of command pressing down on him, the impossible choice between accepting certain losses and potentially creating greater ones. He looked at Phantom's service record displayed on his terminal. 73 combat missions, 0 losses, commendations for valor that read like fiction. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the Virginia coast, indifferent to human suffering or military necessity. The tactical radio burst to life with Neptune 7's increasingly desperate transmissions, each one weaker than the last, painting a picture of men slowly losing their battle against nature's overwhelming power. Phantom's Super Hornet sat in Hangar 7 like a caged predator, its twin General Electric F414 engines capable of producing 22,000 pounds of thrust each. The aircraft represented the pinnacle of American military aviation technology: radar systems that could track targets beyond visual range, fly-by-wire controls that could compensate for pilot error, and hardened electronics designed to survive electromagnetic pulses from nuclear weapons. But none of that technology had been designed for the meteorological hell raging outside. Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos, Phantom's crew chief, ran her hands along the aircraft's titanium-reinforced fuselage with the reverence of someone who understood that machines, like people, had souls. She had prepared this particular Super Hornet for 47 combat missions, watching it return scarred but intact from encounters that had destroyed lesser aircraft. "Ma'am, she's ready if you are," Santos said as Phantom approached the aircraft. The crew chief's voice carried professional pride mixed with obvious concern. "But I've never pre-flighted for conditions like this. The wind alone could flip her during taxi." Phantom climbed into the cockpit, her movements automatic after thousands of hours in similar seats. The familiar embrace of the ejection seat, the comforting weight of her helmet, the soft glow of instruments coming alive, these sensations had become as natural as breathing. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the aircraft seemed to sense the danger ahead. "Control," Phantom requesting immediate weather update on approach corridor to Neptune 7's position. "Phantom, control. Winds now 105 knots sustained, gusting to 130. Ceiling 00, visibility less than 1/4 mile. Lightning strikes occurring every 30 to 40 seconds across your intended route." The air traffic controller's voice carried barely concealed disbelief. "Ma'am, respectfully request you reconsider this mission." Through her headset, Phantom could hear Neptune 7's weakening radio calls, Rodriguez's condition deteriorating with each transmission. She thought about her own brother, a Marine who had died in Fallujah when his convoy was ambushed and air support couldn't reach them due to political restrictions. She had joined the Navy partly to ensure other families wouldn't experience that helpless grief. "Control," Phantom copies weather report. Request immediate clearance for takeoff. The tower controller's pause lasted long enough for Phantom to hear her own heartbeat. "Phantom, control clears you for takeoff, runway 27, Godspeed." As her engines spooled up to full power, the Super Hornet shook against the wind like a living thing eager for flight. The storm seemed to sense her challenge, intensifying its assault on the air base. The takeoff roll felt like accelerating through a war zone. Her aircraft broke ground at exactly 14:23 local time, climbing into atmospheric chaos that immediately tested every system on board. The Super Hornet bucked and rolled through wind shear that would have torn apart civilian aircraft, its computer systems working frantically to maintain stable flight. Rain struck her canopy with such violence that visibility dropped to mere feet, turning the world into a gray-black blur of motion and fury. "Control," Phantom airborne, heading 085 toward Neptune 7's last known position. Her voice remained steady despite the aircraft's violent motion. "Estimate time to target area 15 minutes. "Roger, Phantom. Be advised, we're showing lightning activity directly in your path. Multiple strikes per minute." Through her radar display, the storm revealed its true structure. Not just bad weather, but a massive atmospheric engine generating violence on a scale that dwarfed human technology. Wind speeds that exceeded those found in major hurricanes, electrical activity that made the aircraft's metal skin a lightning rod, and turbulence that could snap an aircraft's spine if hit wrong. At 8,000 feet, Phantom encountered the storm's true fury. Her aircraft suddenly dropped 300 feet in a downdraft that slammed her against her restraint system with enough force to blur her vision. The Super Hornet's engines, designed to operate in combat conditions, began fluctuating as they ingested rain and debris at rates beyond their specifications. Warning, engine temperature rising, her onboard systems announced with mechanical calm. Warning, multiple system malfunctions detected. Phantom's hands moved across her control panel with practiced precision, shutting down non-essential systems to preserve power for flight controls and navigation. The storm was trying to kill her aircraft systematically, attacking each vulnerable system in sequence. Lightning struck her port wing, sending electrical fire dancing across her cockpit instruments. For 3 terrifying seconds, every display went dark before backup systems restored partial functionality. The strike had fried her primary communication system, leaving only emergency frequencies operational. Through breaks in the chaos, she caught glimpses of the ocean below, waves the size of buildings moving with the ponderous power of geological forces. Any aircraft that went down in these conditions would simply vanish, becoming another statistic in military aviation's long history of losses to weather. Neptune 7, this is Navy air support, how copy? Her transmission fought through static and interference, barely audible above atmospheric noise. The response came fragmented, desperate. Navy, this is Neptune 7, Rodriguez critical, platform breaking, need immediate. She was still 12 minutes away, flying through the worst weather any pilot had ever attempted to navigate. At 12,000 feet, Phantom's Super Hornet encountered wind shear so severe that her aircraft's computer systems briefly gave up trying to maintain stable flight. The fly-by-wire controls, designed to prevent pilot error by smoothing out dangerous inputs, found themselves overwhelmed by atmospheric forces that exceeded their programming parameters. For 30 seconds, Phantom was essentially flying a $40 million glider through a hurricane. Her artificial horizon spun wildly as the aircraft tumbled through conflicting air masses. Rain and hail pelted her canopy with machine gun intensity, creating a cacophony that drowned out her engine noise. The Super Hornet's titanium frame groaned under stresses. It had never been designed to handle metal fatiguing in real time, as atmospheric forces tried to tear the aircraft apart. "Come on, girl," Phantom whispered to her aircraft, her voice barely audible above the storm's fury. "We've been through worse than this." But they hadn't, and she knew it. This storm represented the absolute limit of what any pilot or aircraft could survive. Her fuel consumption had increased 40% due to constant course corrections and power adjustments, meaning her mission window was shrinking rapidly. If she couldn't find Neptune 7 within the next 8 minutes, she wouldn't have enough fuel to return to base. Through her failing radar system, she detected what might have been the SEAL team's platform, a metallic signature barely distinguishable from the electronic noise generated by the storm. The target lay 6 miles ahead, through the densest part of the weather system where wind speeds peaked and lightning strikes occurred every 15 seconds. Neptune 7, Navy Air inbound your position, 8 to 6 minutes. She had to shout into her microphone to be heard above the static. Prepare for immediate extraction. Navy, Kent, Rodriguez unconscious, platform, apart. The transmission died in a burst of interference that suggested Neptune 7's communication equipment had finally succumbed to the weather. Phantom was now flying blind into a rescue attempt where she couldn't communicate with the people she was trying to save. Her aircraft shuddered through another lightning strike, this one close enough to leave afterimages burned into her retinas. The electrical discharge temporarily scrambled her navigation systems, leaving her dependent on dead reckoning, an instinct to find 8 men lost in the vastness of the storm-tossed Atlantic. Below, she knew, Neptune 7 was fighting its own battle against time and physics, their platform disintegrating beneath them, while one of their teammates slowly died from hypothermia. The storm seemed to intensify as Phantom approached Neptune 7's coordinates, as if nature itself resented her intrusion into its domain. Visibility dropped to zero, her radar painted meaningless static, and her aircraft bucked through turbulence that stressed its airframe beyond design specifications. This was flying in its most primitive form, pilot against elements, technology reduced to barely functional basics, survival dependent on skill and determination alone. Through a momentary break in the cloud cover, Phantom glimpsed something that made her heart skip, a metallic glint on the ocean's surface, barely visible between mountainous waves. The platform, or what remained of it, pitched and rolled like a toy boat in a child's bathtub. Even from 3,000 feet above, she could see it was breaking apart, sections of deck plating torn away by waves that towered above the structure. Neptune 7, I have visual on your position. She transmitted on all emergency frequencies, hoping someone could still receive. Stand by for extraction pattern. No response came through the static, but she could see small figures moving on the platform's remaining intact sections. The SEALs were still alive, still fighting, but their time was measured in minutes rather than hours. Phantom began her descent through atmospheric chaos that would have challenged test pilots in optimal conditions. Her aircraft dropped through alternating layers of violent updrafts and downdrafts, each transition threatening to snap her wings or overstress her engines. The Super Hornet's computer systems worked frantically to maintain controlled flight, making thousands of micro-adjustments per second to keep the aircraft from tumbling into an unrecoverable spin. At 1,000 feet, she encountered the storm's surface effects, wind shear so extreme that her airspeed indicator fluctuated between dangerous extremes. Too slow meant stalling and crashing. Too fast meant losing control or breaking apart from structural stress. She had perhaps 30 seconds to execute a rescue that normally required calm conditions and precise coordination. The platform appeared in her windscreen like a vision from a nightmare. What had once been a stable oil rig platform was now a twisted wreck of metal and cables, waves washing completely over its deck with each swell. She could see the SEALs clustered on the highest remaining section, their survival suits bright orange against the gray chaos. One figure wasn't moving. Her aircraft's rescue hoist had been designed for helicopter operations, not fixed-wing extractions in hurricane conditions. The Super Hornet wasn't built for hovering or precision maneuvering at low speeds. It was a fighter jet pressed into desperate service as a rescue aircraft, because no helicopter could survive these conditions. As Phantom began her approach, the storm unleashed its final, most vicious assault on her mission. Phantom's Super Hornet shook like a living thing as she descended toward Neptune 7's disintegrating platform. At 300 feet above the churning ocean, her aircraft encountered surface effects that no training manual had ever described. Wind patterns twisted into chaos by the interaction between hurricane-force atmospheric pressure and mountainous waves. Her airspeed fluctuated wildly as alternating gusts tried to accelerate her aircraft beyond safe limits or stall it completely. The platform appeared in her targeting system as a constantly moving target, pitching and rolling through motion that would challenge even experienced sailors. Waves crashed completely over its remaining structures every 15 to 20 seconds, temporarily submerging the SEALs who had lashed themselves to whatever solid anchor points remained. Through her aircraft's thermal imaging system, she could identify 8 heat signatures, 7 clustered together, one motionless and cooler than the others. Rodriguez's hypothermia had progressed to the point where his body temperature barely registered above ambient. "This is impossible," she whispered, watching the platform disappear beneath another massive wave. Traditional rescue procedures required stable hover capability and calm conditions. Her Super Hornet possessed neither advantage, and the storm showed no mercy for improvisation. But impossible was a word that had lost meaning during her 73 combat missions over Afghanistan. She had landed damaged aircraft on makeshift strips carved from desert mountains, extracted wounded soldiers from landing zones under active fire, and navigated through weather that had grounded entire squadrons. Each mission had taught her that physics had limits, but determination could sometimes exceed them. She keyed her emergency transmitter to broadcast on all frequencies, hoping Neptune 7's equipment might catch fragments through the atmospheric interference. Neptune 7, prepare for unconventional extraction. I cannot hover, repeat, cannot maintain stable hover. You'll have approximately 20 seconds when I pass overhead. No response penetrated the static, but she saw movement on the platform as the SEALs began repositioning themselves. Her plan violated every regulation in naval aviation, contradicted established rescue procedures, and would probably result in a court-martial if she survived. She would approach the platform at 90 knots, far too fast for safety but slow enough to avoid stalling, and deploy her aircraft's emergency cargo hook system. The SEALs would have to grab the lowered cable during her single pass, then endure being dragged through hurricane conditions until she could gain sufficient altitude for proper hoist operations. The plan's success required split-second timing, perfect coordination with people she couldn't communicate with, and atmospheric conditions to remain stable for exactly the duration of her approach. None of those factors seemed likely. At 100 feet above the waves, Phantom began her rescue approach, flying her multi-million-dollar fighter aircraft like a World War II dive bomber, attacking a moving target in the worst whether any pilot had ever attempted to navigate. The platform rushed toward her through sheets of rain that turned her windscreen into an abstract blur of motion. Her aircraft's proximity sensors screamed warnings about the approaching surface. Computer systems designed for high-altitude combat operations, now struggling to process low-level flight through atmospheric chaos. The Super Hornet bucked and rolled as conflicting air masses tried to flip it inverted or slam it into the ocean. 50 feet, 40, 30. Through breaks in the rain, she could see individual SEALs now, their faces turned upward toward her approaching aircraft. They had formed a human chain on the platform's highest point, the strongest men anchored to structural supports, while others extended toward the spot where her cable would pass. Their orange survival suits stood out like beacons against the platform's twisted metal. 20 feet above the platform, Phantom deployed her emergency cargo hook, a thick steel cable unreeling behind her aircraft as she passed overhead at 87 knots. The timing had to be perfect too early, and the cable would miss the SEALs entirely. Too late, and it would strike the platform's superstructure. She felt the cable go taut. The sudden weight transfer nearly stalled her aircraft as 7 men, and their gear suddenly became external cargo hanging beneath her Super Hornet. Her engines, already stressed by atmospheric conditions, now struggled to maintain flight with an additional 1,500 pounds of human cargo swaying in hurricane winds. The aircraft's computer systems registered multiple warnings as weight distribution shifted beyond normal parameters. But she was climbing, slowly and painfully, carrying Neptune 7 away from their disintegrating platform and toward the relative safety of higher altitude. Through her rearview mirror, she caught a final glimpse of the platform as another massive wave struck it. The remaining structure collapsed completely, disappearing beneath the churning Atlantic like it had never existed. 7 men dangled beneath her aircraft, their lives dependent on her ability to fly through the storm's continuing fury while maintaining enough control to eventually hoist them safely into her aircraft's cargo bay. Rodriguez remained unconscious, his condition critical, hanging motionless in the human chain his teammates had formed to keep him secure. The hardest part of the mission was just beginning. At 800 feet, with 7 SEALs suspended beneath her aircraft in hurricane conditions, Phantom encountered the storm's most vicious turbulence yet. Her Super Hornet pitched and rolled through air masses moving in different directions at different speeds, creating wind shear that threatened to tear her improvised cargo loose or snap her aircraft's airframe. The men hanging below swung like pendulums, their combined weight creating aerodynamic instabilities that her flight computer couldn't compensate for. Warning: external load exceeding safe parameters, her aircraft systems announced with mechanical indifference. Warning: structural stress approaching critical limits. Through her headset, she could hear fragments of conversation from the SEALs below, their voices carried by the cable's vibrations. Professional calm mixed with understandable fear as elite warriors found themselves hanging beneath a fighter jet in the worst weather any of them had ever experienced. Rodriguez still unconscious, platforms gone, cable holding, but never seen flying like this. Their trust in her abilities was absolute and terrifying. These men had willingly grabbed a cable from an aircraft piloted by someone they'd never met, gambling their lives on her skill and the structural integrity of equipment never designed for this purpose. Navy SEALs didn't surrender control easily, but they had no choice except to hang on and pray that Phantom could somehow navigate them both through the continuing storm. Her fuel gauge showed critical levels now, consumption accelerated by the constant power adjustments needed to maintain stable flight with external cargo. She had perhaps 12 minutes of flight time remaining, enough to reach the coastline but not enough for complex maneuvering or multiple approach attempts. The extraction would have to succeed on the first try. Control: Phantom inbound with Neptune 7 aboard external sling. Request immediate emergency landing clearance and medical standing by for hypothermia victim. The response came through heavy static. Phantom, confirm you have all members. 7 souls secured, 1 critical medical emergency. Estimate 10 minutes to touchdown. What she didn't tell them was that her aircraft's electrical systems were failing systematically, damaged by multiple lightning strikes and the stress of carrying external cargo through hurricane conditions. Her primary flight display flickered intermittently. Navigation systems provided increasingly unreliable data, and her communication equipment barely functioned. She was essentially flying blind through a storm that hadn't finished trying to kill them all. The coastline appeared through her failing instruments like a beacon of salvation, runway lights barely visible through the continuing rain and wind. But landing a fighter jet with 7 men hanging beneath it presented challenges that no pilot had ever trained for, complications that could easily turn a successful rescue into a catastrophic accident. At 200 feet above Naval Air Station Oceana's main runway, Phantom began the most technically demanding landing of her career, fighting to bring her damaged aircraft and its human cargo safely to ground, while hurricane-force winds tried to slam them all into the tarmac. The approach to runway 27 required precision that bordered on supernatural, compensating for wind conditions that shifted unpredictably, and an aircraft whose handling characteristics had been fundamentally altered by external cargo. Her Super Hornet responded sluggishly to control inputs, its computer systems struggling to maintain stable flight, with 7 human beings creating drag and instability beneath the fuselage. 100 feet, 7550. Through her windscreen, she could see emergency vehicles positioned along the runway, their lights creating a corridor through the darkness and rain. Medical personnel stood ready with equipment for treating severe hypothermia, while crash teams prepared for the possibility that her unconventional landing might end in disaster. At 20 feet above the runway, Phantom began lowering the SEALs toward the tarmac, using her aircraft's cargo hoist to deposit them gently while maintaining forward momentum to prevent stalling. The maneuver required split-second timing. Too fast, and the men would impact the ground dangerously. Too slow, and her aircraft would lose lift and crash. The first SEAL touched down on the runway's centerline, immediately rolling to absorb impact before sprinting clear of the landing zone. The others followed in rapid succession, each man releasing from the cable and clearing the area with practiced efficiency. Rodriguez, unconscious and supported by his teammates, was lowered last, medical personnel rushing to his position before his feet touched ground. "Neptune 7 clear of aircraft," came the radio call from ground control. "All personnel accounted for, medical team responding to critical patient." Phantom's Super Hornet, suddenly relieved of its external cargo, lurched upward before she could compensate. Her aircraft felt alien now. Its weight distribution returned to normal, but its systems damaged and unreliable. She had perhaps 3 minutes of fuel remaining, enough for one approach to landing but no opportunity for corrections if something went wrong. Her final approach took place in relative silence. The storm's fury diminished to merely dangerous rather than impossible conditions. Rain still hammered her canopy and winds gusted beyond safe limits, but after flying through the storm's heart for 47 minutes, normal bad weather felt manageable. The Super Hornet's wheels touched runway 27 at 15:18, exactly 55 minutes after takeoff. Phantom brought her aircraft to a stop with careful precision, engines winding down as emergency crews surrounded the jet to assess damage and ensure her safety. Through her canopy, she could see medical teams working frantically on Rodriguez while his teammates stood nearby, their faces reflecting exhaustion and gratitude in equal measure. They had survived conditions that should have killed them, rescued by a pilot whose skill had exceeded the boundaries of possibility. Commander Morrison approached her aircraft as she completed shutdown procedures, his expression mixing relief with professional concern about the regulations she had violated and the risk she had taken. The storm continued its assault on the airbase, but its fury seemed diminished now, defeated by a single pilot's refusal to accept the impossible. In the medical tent erected beside the runway, Rodriguez's core temperature slowly rose as heated fluids and warming blankets fought to reverse hours of life-threatening hypothermia. His teammates maintained vigil, these elite warriors brought together by their shared experience of depending completely on someone they had never met, someone whose call sign would become legend in their community. Outside, the storm that meteorologists had declared unsurvivable began to weaken, moving inland to spend its remaining fury against forests and mountains, rather than fragile human aircraft, and the extraordinary people who flew them beyond the limits of reason and possibility. The debriefing took place 18 hours later in a secure conference room overlooking the same runway where Phantom had landed her damaged Super Hornet, with 7 lives hanging beneath it. Hurricane conditions had given way to ordinary November rain, the kind of weather that grounded civilian flights but barely registered as noteworthy for military operations. Rodriguez sat at the conference table wearing hospital scrubs and thermal blankets. His color returned to normal after a night of intensive treatment for severe hypothermia. Doctors had confirmed he would make a complete recovery, though he would carry permanent reminders of how close death had approached on that disintegrating platform. The 7 members of Neptune 7 occupied one side of the table, their usual confidence tempered by the memory of absolute helplessness in conditions that had exceeded even their extensive survival training. Navy SEALs were accustomed to controlling their environment through superior preparation and overwhelming skill, but the storm had reduced them to refugees clinging to wreckage while waiting for salvation. Phantom sat across from them, her flight suit replaced by dress blues that emphasized her relatively small stature among men selected for physical presence and intimidating competence. Without her helmet and survival gear, she looked more like an academic than a combat pilot, someone who might teach aerospace engineering rather than fly impossible missions through atmospheric hell. But her eyes held depths that reflected 74 combat missions, and the knowledge that yesterday's flight had pushed beyond the absolute limits of aviation safety. "Commander Castellanos," began Captain Sarah Williams, the investigating officer assigned to review the mission, Yesterday's operation violated numerous regulations regarding flight safety, risk assessment, and proper rescue procedures. Your decision to launch in weather conditions that had grounded all other aircraft, including specialized rescue units, demonstrated either exceptional judgment or catastrophic recklessness. The room fell silent except for rain pattering against reinforced windows. Everyone present understood that Phantom's career hung in the balance, that military aviation demanded strict adherence to regulations precisely because individual heroics could easily become organizational disasters. However, Captain Williams continued, the alternative to your actions would have been the loss of 8 Navy personnel, including 1 death from hypothermia that was already in progress. Your mission succeeded where conventional rescue operations would have failed, and your flying demonstrated technical skill that exceeded what most pilots could achieve in optimal conditions. Neptune 7's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, leaned forward. "Ma'am, permission to speak." At Williams' nod, he continued, "Captain, I've been a SEAL for 12 years. I've survived situations that killed other men, completed missions that seemed impossible, and led teams through combat that would break most people. But yesterday, hanging beneath Commander Castellano's aircraft in hurricane conditions, I experienced something I'd never felt before." He paused, choosing his words carefully. Complete trust in another person's competence. The weight of his statement settled over the room like a blessing, carrying the authority of men whose survival depended on accurate assessment of risk and capability. Phantom's hands remained folded in her lap, her expression neutral as she waited for official judgment on actions that had saved 8 lives, while violating dozens of regulations designed to prevent exactly the kind of risk she had accepted. "The Navy faces a fundamental question," Captain Williams said finally. "Do we court-martial a pilot for violating safety protocols, or do we recognize that exceptional circumstances sometimes require exceptional responses? Do we punish someone for succeeding where others would have failed, or do we acknowledge that some missions exist beyond the boundaries of normal procedure?" The answer would determine not just Phantom's future, but establish precedent for how the military balanced individual initiative against institutional control. Outside, ordinary rain continued falling on a base where extraordinary people prepared for missions that would test the limits of human courage and technological capability. The deliberation lasted 47 minutes, during which Neptune 7 waited in the corridor while senior officers debated whether to court-martial or commend the pilot who had saved their lives. The SEALs maintained their usual stoic composure, but their concern for Phantom's fate was obvious to anyone who understood the warrior's code of loyalty and honor. When the conference room doors reopened, Captain Williams emerged with an expression that revealed nothing. "Commander Castellanos, please step forward." Phantom stood at attention, her posture reflecting 12 years of military discipline and the knowledge that her career might end with the next words spoken. She had known the risks when she launched into impossible weather, accepting that saving Neptune 7 might cost her wings and military future. "Commander, after reviewing all aspects of yesterday's mission, this board finds that your actions, while technically in violation of established safety protocols, demonstrated exceptional judgment, superior airmanship, and unwavering commitment to the welfare of fellow service members." The tension in the corridor was palpable, as Neptune 7 listened to words that would determine whether their rescuer faced punishment or recognition. Your decision to launch in weather conditions deemed unsurvivable by meteorological experts required both technical skill and moral courage that reflect the highest traditions of naval aviation. Your execution of an improvised rescue using equipment and procedures never designed for such conditions demonstrated piloting abilities that exceed normal parameters. Captain Williams paused, her official demeanor softening slightly. "However, We cannot ignore that your mission succeeded purely because your individual capabilities exceeded what regulations assume possible. Lesser pilots attempting similar actions would likely have created additional casualties rather than preventing them. Rodriguez stepped forward from his teammates. "Ma'am, permission to speak." At Williams' nod, he continued in a voice still hoarse from his ordeal. "Captain, I was unconscious when Commander Castellanos pulled us off that platform. I don't remember the flight or the landing, but I woke up in a hospital bed instead of drowning.